Good afternoon and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about conceptual knowledge. And before we begin about what conceptual knowledge is, we're going to first define what knowledge is. And from what we understand by what knowledge is, simply put, knowledge is what we know. It's an acquaintance with facts, truth, or principle, as from study or investigation. So, when we talk about knowledge, we're talking about what we know, true facts, true principle that we acquire through study or investigation. All right. So, a more broader definition for what knowledge is that knowledge is the familiarity, awareness, understanding of someone or something, such as facts, information, descriptions, or skills, which is acquired through experience or education by perceiving, discovering, or learning. Let's take that more slowly. So, we say that knowledge is familiarity or awareness or understanding. So, the first three: familiarity, awareness, understanding of someone or something, such as facts. So, what are we understanding? We're understanding facts, information, descriptions, or skills. We're becoming familiar with that, or we're becoming aware of that. So knowledge is the familiarity, awareness, understanding of facts, information, descriptions, or skills. So facts, what we know; information, tidbits of knowledge; and descriptions, how to; and then skills, how to do something too. So which is acquired through experience or education by perceiving, discovering, or learning. So that's what knowledge is in a broader definition. We say knowledge is familiarity, awareness, understanding of someone or something, such as facts, information, description, or skills, which is acquired through experience or education by perceiving, discovering, or learning. So let's move down to the types of knowledge that we have, or how knowledge can be divided into. So we have different types of knowledge. We have like knowledge of what we know, factual information, which we call declarative knowledge. So the knowledge that we're going to be treating today is going to be in threefold. We have declarative knowledge, conceptual knowledge, and then procedural knowledge. So when we go to what declarative knowledge is, so basically declarative knowledge is information about what exists, what we know, factual information. So when they say what is the capital of Nigeria and you're saying Abuja, so it's more like you have like a mental map in your head where you now scan through and then you try to find out, do I know this information or do I not know this information? So that's basically how factual knowledge works. Um okay, so for example, now when they say, okay, how many sides does a triangle have? You have an idea that okay, a triangle has three sides and three angles. That's a factual knowledge. There are also ways in which factual knowledge can become conceptual knowledge, but we're also going to talk about that a little bit further down the line. So basically, with factual knowledge or declarative knowledge, it is information about what we know, about facts that exist. Okay, so, but we need to also understand that with declarative knowledge, we need to have some prior understanding or some kind of prior knowledge to understand them. And what do I mean by that? It means that if you do not know that the capital of Abuja, the capital of Nigeria is Abuja, you will not know the answer to that question because you do not have the facts. So, for example, now if they ask you something as much more difficult as what's the capital of Mongolia, if you've not been familiarized with that concept or that knowledge before, even when you search through your mind or you try to search through your brain, you'll still not be able to find out the meaning or what the capital of Mongolia is. And that is because factual knowledge has to depend on some kind of pre-existing knowledge that is already like in your mind. All right. So it's just more like, okay, with factual knowledge, your brain will just look up the table of facts and information that it knows, and then it scans through and try to say, okay, the capital of Nigeria is Abuja, the capital of Mongolia is Ulaanbaatar, that kind of thing. So, but if you don't know it, then it's three things that can happen. You say the wrong answer because you believe that you have that information, but it was the wrong information that you learned, or you actually come up blank, meaning that when your brain scans and then finds the table, it's like, oh, there's nothing here, and then there's no answer to that question. Or the third one is if you actually do know the answer and you say, oh, the capital of Nigeria is Abuja or the capital of Mongolia is Balanta, that kind of thing. That's how declarative knowledge works. Okay, so let's move slightly to conceptual knowledge before we even explain it further. Conceptual knowledge is all about relationships, it's about conferring meanings of what we know. So we can define conceptual knowledge as refers to the understanding of concepts, principles, and generalization. It is the type of knowledge that allows us to recognize objects and events and to make inferences and relationships about their properties, knowing that. Okay, so let's explain this more simply. So with conceptual knowledge, you are starting to infer relationships, you're starting to find out more information, you're starting to have more information about these things. So let's take an example of um the one we said where we say a triangle has three sides. But when you turn that declarative knowledge to a conceptual knowledge, with that you start to have more inferences concerning what a triangle has. So you can say that, oh, a scaling triangle is also a triangle, although it does not have three equal sides, or an equilateral triangle is also a triangle, but it has three equal sides. So that's how conceptual knowledge work. It's trying to say, okay, I know that it's trying to give you more information. So, for example, when you say lists can be factual, declarative, but when you now go as far as saying explain, so from explaining is where conceptual knowledge comes from. It's like, okay, I have to give more information concerning this thing. That's how conceptual knowledge works. So, before we go further down into defining conceptual knowledge and trying to understand it, we're also just going to talk a little bit about how facts can be derived from concepts. So, for example, now, most of the time, children learn about things in their environment through experience or by being familiar with it. So, let's say, how does a child, like earlier, we talked about schema theory, and we had some kind of examples about it, about how children can find, like, okay, let's say they know that this is a dog through experience with a dog, that kind of stuff. So if we know that, okay, dogs have furs, dogs have this, or dogs have that or this, it can also be transcribed, like, meaning conceptual knowledge can become factual knowledge, can become declarative knowledge. Like when you know certain information concerning it can help you understand it. So let's just take it back a little bit to declarative knowledge, or how we're saying about how declarative knowledge is what we know, and how you cannot necessarily say that, okay, with declarative knowledge you need to have too much information about it. You just need to know it. You have to look up a table in your brain and then know it as it is. But we also need to know that with declarative knowledge, you don't need to know much more about it, like much more about what you need to know. So, for example, now the example we used before, where we said, okay, a where we said the capital of Nigeria is Abuja. With declarative knowledge, you don't need to know about the cultures, you don't need to know about the type of food that exists in Nigeria and all of that. But with conceptual knowledge, you need to know all those details or more details that can now help you fit these things in. So, for example, now if I want to say, if I give an example of, oh, there's a particular country that loves to cook jollof rice, they love to dance, they have to over 200 cultures, they have um they have gained their independence some 60 years ago, this and that and that. Those are concepts, like those are concepts that surround a particular information. So with that, you see how with all those concepts we can now derive the factual knowledge. So try and talk too let's not try and talk too much about it. So we also need to know too that with conceptual knowledge, yeah, it's just more about, okay, how we are in school and then we know certain things, but until we go to the outside world or to the workforce, we can't necessarily apply that knowledge. So it's just more like a surgeon has read all about surgery, knows how to perform surgery, and sorry, has read about the concept of surgery, knows all the concept of surgery, know that, okay, you have to anesthetize, you have to do this or do that and all of that. So those are the concepts that he knows. So that leads us to procedural knowledge, which is another type of knowledge that we're going to be discussing. So in procedural knowledge, it's knowing how to. It's like knowing how to. Okay. So if we ask a question and we say, okay, how would a dog get get out of the woods if he is lost, if the dog is lost. So we can now use stuff like, okay, the dog has a good sense of smell, we'll try and smell for food. The dog can't. So you see how sometimes all this knowledge can actually interact with one another, or they can interact with each other. You can know from that example that we're also talking about a little bit about the concepts of dogs, meaning that dogs have good sense of smell. And then we're now also talking about how they are going to perform a particular task, or how they are going to perform the task of leaving the woods when they are lost. You get it? All right. So with procedural knowledge is knowing how to do something. So it's just more like, for example, now with conceptual knowledge is about, okay, I've read all the things I need to know. I know about how to perform a surgery, but I've not necessarily performed the surgery before, and I cannot yet call myself a surgeon until I've actually performed the surgery. So the process of knowing how to perform the surgery, down from opening, cutting up, doing whatever you need to do, that is what procedural knowledge is. It's about knowing how to. All right. So it's just more like, okay, a cook saying that they know the concepts of food and they know the concept of so many dishes, but they've never cooked before. So when it comes to the cooking, the act itself, the practical, that's what procedural knowledge is all about. All right. So let's move on. Okay. So to define it, we say that procedural knowledge involves knowing how to perform tasks or carry out a procedure. It is a practical action oriented It's a practical action oriented knowledge that guides the execution of skills or actions. That is knowing how, e.g., driving a car, riding a bicycle, writing your signature. So let us just repeat it again. It is a practical action oriented knowledge that guides the execution of skills and actions. Practical action oriented knowledge that guides the execution of skills and actions. Knowing how to. That's what procedural knowledge is all about. So let's come back to conceptual knowledge, because the topic that we're treating today is conceptual knowledge. So with what conceptual knowledge, we've already defined that. So let's move on to what concepts are, or what concepts mean. So we know that concepts are defined as a mental representation of a class or category of objects, events, and abstract ideas. So concepts have been defined as a mental representation of class or category of object, events, and abstract idea. So, what is concept? Concepts are defined as mental representations of a class or category of one, events, two, abstract ideas, and three, objects. All right. Okay, so let's move on to what a category means. A category includes all possible examples of a particular concept. A category includes all possible examples of a particular concept. So, therefore, for example, now the category cats would include normal cats that we know about, would include wild cats, would include Siamese cats, would include leopards, etc. So categories include all possible examples of a particular concept. So let's look at another example. So when we use an example of, let's say, a category called bird, a bird is going to include, or doves, is going to include bats, is going to include penguins, is going to include like all of that kind of thing. So those are what categories are: all possible examples of a particular concept. That is what a category is. So all right, so we need to know that once we've assigned a category to an object, we call it categorization. All right, so we know that the process in which we assign categories to an object is called categorization. So basically, categorization is the process in which we assign categories to an object. So we need to also understand that once we have assigned an object to a category, we know a lot about that object. So it means that, for example, let's take the category animals. Animals is a broad category. Once we've assigned the category to animals, we know that animals will include reptiles, will include humans, will include cats, would include dogs, will include mammals, all that kind of thing. So that's what it means by when we say that when we assign a category to an object, we know a lot about that object. So for example, let's even take another smaller category of like birds. We know that birds have wings, birds can fly, birds lay eggs, like you get it. So you can already infer relationship, or you can infer characteristics of that particular object within that category. All right. So we also need to know that categories are pointers to knowledge. Meaning they point us to knowledge, just like I've explained. You see how that works, how categories can give you information about a particular concept or an object, and then point you towards the knowledge and the all-encompassing knowledge that exists within an object, meaning all we need to know about that object. I hope you understand that. All right. So we also need to know that being able to place things into categories help us to understand behaviors. So for example, now when we place an object into the category reptiles, we know that the behaviors of reptiles can include certain things. Maybe for an example, reptiles crawl, or they have very tiny legs or insignificant legs. We can also say examples of those reptiles can be snakes, or snakes or lizards, that kind of thing. So we need to also know that being placed into categories helps us to understand the behaviors of that category. So for example, now what do we know as the behavior of dogs? We know that dogs bark, dogs have fours, dogs have four legs. So we can anticipate that a dog is going to bark. That's what he means by knowing the category or knowing the behaviors that exist within a category. Okay. We also need to know that categorization helps us deal with the world. It helps us to understand the world around us. It helps us to make inferences. It helps us to anticipate the world and deal with the world around us. So categorization also becomes difficult in two ways. For example, if you encounter something unfamiliar, so when you encounter something unfamiliar, you cannot categorize it because you do not know it. So that's how categorization becomes difficult. So number two, you have a brain injury that makes it difficult to identify different objects or know what they are used for. So we need to know that in ways in which categorization might be difficult, it might be in two ways. It means in one way being that we encounter something that we do not know, something that is unfamiliar. Or number two way is that we do not know. Number two way is that we do not understand, or sorry, we do not know it, meaning it's unfamiliar. That's number one. Then for number two, we have a brain injury that does not, that makes us unable to recognize objects. All right, so let's move down to the next thing of how categories are formed. How are categories formed? So there are four basic ways in which categories are formed that we're going to be discussing today. And we have the definitional approach, we have the exemplar approach, we have the prototypical approach, and we have the hierarchical organization. So let me just go over it again. For the four ways that we're going to talk about in how categories are formed, we have the definitional approach, we have the exemplar approach, we have the hierarchical organization, and we have the prototypical approach. So let's first talk about the definitional approach. So what is the definitional approach? When you hear the definitional approach, think definition. What is defined? Definitional approach, that is a way in which categorization happens or in which categories are formed. So definitional approach, what does it mean? It means that according to the definitional approach of categories, we can decide whether something belongs to a category or is a member of a category by deciding whether a particular object meets the definition of a category. So that's what definitional approach is. It's talking about definitions. Does this object that I want to categorize, does it meet the definition of this category? That's what definitional approach is all about. So let's take examples. So for example, now with the definitional approach, let's say that we decide that according to the definition of a triangle is a shape with three sides and it has three angles. That's the definition of a triangle. So when we now want to say, when we want to now decide whether an object belongs to a definitional category, belongs to a category based off the definitional approach, we're not going to say, okay, what are the different types of triangles that we can come across? We have the scaling triangle. Scaling triangle, although the different sides are different, the sides are different, but we can still say that, okay, based off the definition of a triangle, how many sides does this scaling triangle have? It has 1, 2, 3, meaning that it is a triangle. How many sides does the equilateral triangle have? It has 1, 2, 3, and it has 3 sides, meaning that it is a triangle. So you understand how that works. Or the same way where we say, okay, a chair is something that helps us rest our, that somebody can sit on and it has four legs and it helps us rest our back. So when we see a chair that has four legs, we can say, oh, this is a chair that has four legs. We can sit on it and we can rest our back. Therefore, this is a chair. But there's also a limitation for the definitional approach, because most of the things that we encounter in our day-to-day lives do not necessarily fit into a very strict definition. So to now combat that limitation of the definitional approach, we have something called family resemblance. So basically, to combat the limitation of definitional approach, because of most natural objects and man-made objects, the definitional approach does not work also well, it does not work all the time, because not so many. For example, now if we see this type of chair now, it does not have four legs, although we can sit and we can rest our back, but it doesn't still have four legs. And if the dictionary definition of a chair is that it must have four legs, are we going to say that this is not a chair? So that is what the family resemblance tried to solve. So with the family resemblance, it's talking about family resemblance was accommodated within specific definitions. What does that mean? It means that for us to overcome the limitation of the definitional approach, we now accommodate something called family resemblance. And family resemblance refers to the idea that things in a particular category resemble one another in a number of ways. That is what family resemblance means. Things within a particular category resemble one another in a number of ways. So instead of certain definite criteria that every member of the category must meet, the family resemblance allows for some variation. So let me explain that. We know that family resemblance refers to the idea that certain things within a category resemble one another in a particular number of ways, and then instead of certain strict categories or definitions that these things must meet, the family resemblance is saying that it can have a little bit of variation. So for example, now we can still classify this as a chair because we can sit on it and we can rest our back, which is already in is a resemblance to the normal definition of how we say a chair has four legs. We can sit on it and we can rest our back. So that's what family resemblance tried to do when it came to definitional approach. It's trying to say, okay, we should allow for some variations, because so many of the things we encounter in our day-to-day lives does not necessarily fit into these strict criteria where we say, oh, this is a chair and every chair must have four legs. We have chairs that do not have four legs. Or for example, when we say, okay, let's give another example of a bird. We say a dove is a bird. What's the definition of a bird? We say that, okay, a bird has wings, a bird has a beak, and a bird can fly. That is like the simple definition of a bird. But when we come to penguins, penguins are also birds, but they can't fly. So do we now say that, okay, because penguins cannot fly, we cannot categorize them as birds? That's wrong. So what the family resemblance is trying to say is that once they have some type of set similarities and there's like little variations within them, we can still categorize them under that same category. So for the bird example that we use, we know that penguins lay eggs and penguins have fours. So, or penguins have like that. We know that they lay eggs. So because of that, we can now say, okay, they have some similarities with birds and therefore we can categorize them as birds. That's what it is about the definitional approach. Moving on, we'll be talking about the prototypical approach or the prototype approach. So, according to the prototype approach of categorization, membership in a category is determined by comparing an object to a prototype that represents the category. So, with the prototypical approach or the prototype approach, this is about comparing an object with the prototype of that category. So what's the prototype of the category? Prototype is a typical member of a category. Thus, a prototype is the average representation of that category. So when we talk about the prototypical approach to categorization, we're talking about the most common or the average representation of that particular category. So for example, now when we say the average representation of a dog, it depends on the culture that we are in. So let's say we're in Nigeria now, the average representation of a dog is a local dog that we know and we already know how it looks like. So when we now go further to now say, okay, we now encounter another type of dog, which is let's say a chihuahua, and then we now say, okay, does this chihuahua have the same characteristics or does it resemble in some way to the local dog that we are familiar with, that this is a dog. So for example, now when it comes to the prototypical approach, we are basing our categorization based off a prototype, and a prototype is an average representation of a particular category. That's what the prototypical approach is. So let's give another example. So let's say the most typical type of bird that we might be familiar with might be a robin, and then we know that a robin has feathers, it has a beak, and it has the ability to fly. But when we come and we encounter a pigeon, based off the prototypical approach, we are not going to compare this the what that pigeon has to the typical representation, which is a robin. So because of the share some similarities with the average representation, we now can now say that okay, we are categorizing it as this. I hope you understand that. So the prototype for the category birds may be based on a bird you usually see, like doves, but not all birds are like doves. Penguins and owls are also birds. Just like how we were explaining before, how a categorization, prototypical approach to categorization is the average representation, and then what we already know, what we see, what we are used to. So, for example, now with the dog example I gave, where we say that the average representation is a local dog. For somebody that has never come across a local dog before, that will not be their average representation. It would be another type of dog, maybe like a Labrador or a Golden Retriever, that kind of thing. So they will now like associate that average representation with a new dog that they come across with. So, for example, now if they're coming across a local dog, they will not take that local dog, which is unfamiliar, they will now use it to compare the normal average representation that they know or what they usually see a dog to be. That's how the prototypical approach to categorization works. All right, so let's just talk about the effect of prototypical objects. So there's certain effects of prototypical objects, and we're going to be discussing four of them. Number one is that prototypical objects have high family resemblance. We can remember that we were talking about family resemblance in the definitional approach, and how we say that family resemblance refers to the idea that things in a particular category resemble one another in a number of ways. You can remember that definition. So with the effect of prototypical object, we can say one effect of prototypical object is that prototypical objects have high family resemblance. Number two is that statements about prototypical objects are verified rapidly. What does that mean? It means that when you see a prototypical object, let's say you see a local dog and you see a golden retriever. A golden retriever to some people is the usual representation of what a dog is, and you see a local dog, it is very easy for you to associate those two together to belong in the same category. Meaning that when you use prototypical approach to categorization, it is very easy for you to associate it together and to say that okay, this new unfamiliar object belongs into this category. So, for example, now we're saying this new local dog belongs to the golden retriever category or belongs to the dog category because of we've already seen how a golden retriever is, and then this local dog has some similarities to a golden retriever. So that's what it means when we say that an effect of a prototypical object is that they are verified rapidly. Number three effect is that prototypical objects are named fast. They're named first. So prototypical objects are named first. And number four is that prototypical objects are affected more by priming. So number one is prototypical objects have high family resemblance. Number two is that statements about prototypical objects are verified rapidly. Number three is that prototypical objects are named first. Number four is that prototypical objects are affected more by priming. All right, so we're going to be moving to the third example that we're going to be talking about today, and sorry, third approach to categorization that we're going to be talking about today, and that's the exemplar approach. So when you hear exemplar, think examples. All right, so that's what the exemplar approach is all about. So the exemplar approach to categorization, like the prototypical approach, involves determining whether an object is similar to other objects. So it's a little bit similar to what we understand in the prototypical approach, because they are both trying to see, are these objects similar enough to belong to the same category. So with exemplar approach, they define the way prototypical approach and exemplar approach differ is that with prototypical approach they use prototypes, but with exemplar approach they use the standard. The standard for the exemplar approach involves many examples, each one called an exemplar. So like I said before, when I said when you're thinking about the exemplar approach, you have to think about examples. So with the exemplar approach, it thinks about examples, many examples that belong to that category. So when we say examples of, let's look at something that is easy. Let's say examples of food. We can say rice, yam, beans, potato, plantain, and all of that. So with the exemplar approach to categorization, it is mainly talking about examples within that category, and each of those examples are called exemplars. That's what it means. So examples are actual members of the category that a person who has encountered in the past. So what is an exemplar? An exemplar is an actual member of a category that a person has encountered in the past. That's what an exemplar is. So for example, now if you've encountered beans as a food in the past, you can now classify that beans is an exemplar of the food category. So anything that you've encountered in the past concerning a particular category is called an exemplar within that category. So you can use that to now talk about or to now categorize new object. So for example, if you've encountered, let's say, stuffs like mango, agbalumo, all of that kind of thing, and then you now know that those are types of fruits and you classify them as types of fruits, as examples of fruit. If you now if you now encounter something such as let's think of something that's not so popular. Let's say a coffee, a cocoa, like cocoa pod. I know that we might have heard of it, but most of the time when we are encountering cocoas, we're almost always encountering cocoas in in its processed form. So for example, now when we now encounter cocoa with, like, in its raw form as a fruit, we can now say that we can now add that cocoa as an example of fruits that we know, or as an exemplar within the fruit category. I hope you understand that. So let's move to the last and final one, which is the hierarchical organization. So you remember that we were talking about how categories are formed, and we've talked about three. And we said number one is the definitional approach, number two is the prototypical approach, number three is the exemplar approach. So right now we're moving to the hierarchical organization in which categories are formed. So what the hierarchical organization is majorly talking about is that categories are formed through hierarchies, meaning that hierarchies. So let's explain it and let's define it. Hierarchical organization of categories involves a system in which larger, more general categories are divided into smaller, more specific categories, creating a number of levels of categories. Let's come again. Hierarchical organization of categories involves a system in which larger, more general categories are divided into smaller, more specific categories, creating a number of levels of categories. So basically, in the hierarchical organization, there are three levels of categories, and we have the superordinate or global level. We have the basic level, and we have the subordinate or specific level. So let's come again. We have the superordinate or global level, we have the basic level, and then we have the subordinate or specific level. So it means that superordinate, another name for superordinate level is the global level, another name for subordinate level is the specific level. All right. So we also need to know that it is proposed that the basic level is psychologically special, because going above it, meaning the global level, results in a large loss of information, and then going below it, which is the subordinate level, results in little gain of information. What does that mean? It means that psychologically we think of the basic level as a special level, because it kind of like represents the object that we're trying to categorize, meaning that it has sufficient information for us. They're telling us that if we go over the basic level to the superordinate level, which is the global level, we would lose a lot of information. So for example, now let's say a basic level of a bird can be, or let's say a basic level of an animal can be a bird, and then the specific level can now be a dove. then the superordinate level can now be animals. So it says that we think of the basic level as psychological special, because when you go over it, which is to animal, when you say animals, so many things can fall under the category called animals. It means that we are losing a lot of information. So imagine you want to tell somebody about a bird, but then you're now talking about animals. I mean, this person can think of reptiles, they can think of snakes, they can think of kangaroos, they can think of zebras and all of that. So it's telling us that when we use, because of how the basic level is, when we try to go above the basic level to define a thing or to categorize a thing, we're going to lose a lot of information, meaning that we're just using the global level. And then when we now come lower to this subordinate level or the specific level to classify, to categorize a thing, an object, we're going to gain so little information. So for example, now if we say dove, so you see that dove is more specific, but it doesn't give us as much information as birds are going to give us. So with birds, we can have different types of conceptual knowledge about birds. We can know that birds have beaks. We can know that birds have lay eggs. We can know that birds are this. But with dove, it's more specific, and we're not gaining a lot of information. So that's what that means. All right. So we need to know that research shows that people with more expertise and familiarity with a particular category tend to focus on the more specific label associated with the specific level. This is because our ability to categorize is learned from experience and depends on which object is typically encountered and what characteristics of the object we pay attention to. So, what does that mean? It means that most of the time, research has shown that we try to classify things based, or we try to categorize objects based off the specific level, that because the specific level is sometimes what we encounter first. So for example, now there's so many species of birds that we might not even know about, but based off what we've encountered, let's say we've encountered a dove before, or we've encountered a chihuahua before as a dog, we most often focus on that specific level of categorization while forgetting other levels of categorization. So let's think of it. If you are thinking of a particular bird in mind, and then we now want to say, okay, this is the bird I'm thinking of, you're not necessarily thinking of the superordinate level of that bird or the basic level of that bird. So what do I mean by that? It means that we're not necessarily thinking of all the other species of bird, or we're not thinking of animals, which is like the superordinate level of what that dove represents. So that's what this was is trying to talk to us about. That we try to recognize a particular category based off experience and familiarity with that category. So once we are familiar with something, we most likely just want to move to the specific level of that thing. All right. I think that actually brings us to the end of this topic called conceptual knowledge. I do hope that we understand it, and if there are any questions at all, we can always type it in the comment section. And thank you so much for listening. I'll meet you in the next topic. Bye.